Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good night, depending on what time you're watching this lecture. My name is Dan Smith. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge. This is my second year teaching with the Institute of Continuing Education at Cambridge, and I've always enjoyed my experiences, and I hope that you enjoy this lecture on American politics. So I'm currently finishing my doctoral thesis on the history of right-wing populism and nationalism in the United States. Obviously I'm an American and this will be on American politics, so I hope that you enjoy the area that is sort of my expertise and my sometimes love interest, you could say. I don't know, just saying I'm very passionate about American politics. So I wanted to break from what I kind of see as like a standard lecture on American politics to give you something a bit more interesting. My lecture will be on American radicalism, so looking at the concept of radicalism, how notions of what is radical change over time, illustrated through a number of important American radicals. And so one of the things I'm doing in describing and showing you these characters is drawing out the context of the worlds they inhabited, the political issues they dealt with, and how the public perception of these figures and their radical political views may have changed over time. So, given that you're writing essays and conducting academic research on these various lectures that you're doing, I thought this would be a better platform for you to explore from. The fact that my lecture covers a fairly broad period of American history, pretty much all of American history, and just kind of looking at different characters over time, leaves a lot up to you to kind of explore and approach what you find the most interesting, and kind of from wherever you want to take the topic. Hopefully you can use bits of this lecture, or you can email me after with questions as a good starting point to then kind of do what you want to do with it. So like I said, this is a bit different than what I would see as a standard lecture on American politics. And I think to preface my lecture, I'll briefly cover what I see as constituting that more standard lecture. So this is not so much to give you the exact details of how the U.S. government works and how it functions, but rather to illustrate a point about what is like what is political science concerned with, and but what is I don't know, but like I want to like just to get this point across of how does the government work and what's unique about the U.S. system. So when we think about the differences between the British or more broadly European politics versus American politics, we can think of two primary institutional differences: the way elections are conducted and the way that the government itself operates. So let's start with the second one, with how the government works. The American government is a federal system. Um, in which states have their own legislatures and can largely make their own laws. These laws, however, are subject to checks from both the court system, the federal court system, and their own court systems, and the kind of laws passed by the Congress. So the federal government itself is composed of three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So the notion of checks and balances, ensuring that no branch has a monopoly over the exercise of power, was crucial to the founding fathers of the American Republic and the writers of the Constitution, and the system is designed with that in mind. So the executive is the presidency. Historically, the power of the executive has grown in times of war. The second Bush administration marking a substantial period of growth in the powers of the presidency. An earlier period was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, when he oversaw U.S. entering World War II and the continuation of a very aggressive and expansive U.S. foreign policy after World War II that required the presidency getting a lot of powers, treaty making powers that previously had been kind of the domain of the Congress, and the Congress made foreign policy. But obviously, a legislative body is much less capable of making quick, kind of decisive decisions in a way that the executive can. But obviously, that can lead in the wrong direction with the war on terror and the sort of Patriot Act and the growth of the kind of surveillance state that happened starting in the second Bush administration in the early 2000s. But I digress. So that's the executive. The legislative is the House of Representatives. The Congress is that Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 senators, two for each state. The House of Representatives always has 435 representatives, which are proportionally assigned to states based on population. And that's based on every 10 years you have the census. So every new census, there's slight shifts. And you also have state level parties and legislatures that can often decide the contours of the different districts. So then you have the judicial, which is crowned by the Supreme Court, which has 9 justices, chief justices. I'm sure, even over here, the fact that the nomination for Supreme Court is a very politically important event. The fact that Trump was able to nominate 3 people to the Supreme Court is fairly important for his longer term legacy, whether I think that's good or bad. But you have the Supreme Court, then you have the state level Supreme Courts, And then in between that, you have the federal appeals courts, which, so if I have a case, goes to my state Supreme Court, I appeal it, and the appeals court sees it as a compelling appeal, they can bring it to the appeals court, and ultimately that funnels cases up to the Supreme Court. Um, so that's a very very quick summary of how the U.S. government works and what's unique about it. Electorally, the U.S. Congress has House of Representative seats. Every House of Representative seat is open every 2 years, while senators get 6 terms and Senate get 6-year terms, and senatorial elections are staggered. State and local elections vary. The president is elected by the Electoral College, which is a fairly antiquated institution rooted in the politics of slaveholding in the early American Republic. So the strange and usually kind of unimportant mechanisms of the Electoral College, how it counts the votes, and on election day, was brought into question over the last few months when ex-president Trump tried to subvert the results of the election in order to maintain power. And this is actually a perfect point for me to transition to the topic of American radicalism. So the most important event of Trump's attempted coup was the January 6th attack on the Capitol building. So just to recap that, Trump riled up his supporters who wanted to stop the certification of what they saw to be false election results by Vice President Pence, who they saw as betraying President Trump, and members of Congress, many of whom were Trump's allies, but who accepted that he lost the election. So Trump and other far-right activists and speakers kind of gave speeches at this event across Washington, and then the crowd marched to the Capitol building, and I'm sure we all saw videos of what happened. 5 people died, including a police officer. Many other police officers were attacked and wounded. Over 100 people were injured. Several hundred people who attended the event have been charged criminally by the FBI, which has conducted a massive national investigation, trying to find out who was there, who were the ones committing violence. One of the more disturbing findings from this investigation is that right-wing militia groups, which have been around in the U.S. for a couple decades now, organized and used military tactics to breach some of the doors of the Capitol building. Many of these attendees were seen with weapons and other tools. So yeah, this is these people. Well, the reason I say this, you can ask a simple question: what brought these people to Washington D.C. on this day? Like I study right-wing politics in the U.S., so this is something I have I know quite well. But I think anyone can see it's sort of the radical notion that President Trump, the election was stolen from him, that he's fighting to save America. Something that I think even I have friends who are Trump supporters who acknowledge that he kind of went crazy at the end. But the people who went down fighting with him and who went to go, some of these people may have killed people if they had the opportunity to, may have tried to have killed representatives if they saw them in the halls of the Capitol building. These people were kind of driven crazy, and they're driven by these ideas. And I think that's these are definitely radical ideas. I don't think they're good. I think it's hard to offer an argument that the ideas motivating people attacking the Capitol building are good. But I make this point because radicalism can take different forms. I think we can look back, both in British history and American history. You can find figures who were reviled in their time, but whose ideas have turned out to be right or turned out to be morally, correct. Perhaps not by the standards of their time, but by later standards and by more progressive and more egalitarian kind of standards. So I want to have that as sort of the backdrop, because political radicalism is alive and well today. You still have violence by political extremists, more from the right. You have left-wing extremism as well. It takes a different form. You're going to see a bit of both in this PowerPoint. So I will just let this begin. So introduction. So this is just going through a little bit of stuff that I would be doing if this was a in-person lecture. So what do you think of when you think of American politics? Trump, two-party system, presidency and Supreme Court, civil rights movement, and other progressive social movements. Now, Black Lives Matter being a sort of social movement about racial equality. Maybe historically, think of the Cold War, anti-communism, these sort of things. And this is just to go through some kind of more technical political science stuff. I thought this was a useful way of kind of framing what I'm trying to do here. So you can think, in scholars and people think of politics as motivated by different factors. So some common ones in political science in particular are interests. So it could be, businesses, corporations, trade associations, could be, the idea of the working class represented maybe by unions or by social democratic parties. Other interest groups form around cultural and religious identities. Some represent progressive forces like unions, while others represent conservative forces like big business or religious conservatives. And you can think of, regardless of the country or the institutional context of how the government works, interests are competing for influence among representatives and government who then, make the laws. So, you have lobbying, you have different things, donations. These are all ways of currying favor for these different interest groups. And, sometimes it happens in corrupt manners of people, giving money to candidates they want because they want them to pass laws that favor them, or it could be through funding a think tank that's shaping, the debate about trade policy or something like that in a way that directly, indirectly or indirectly affects my business or something. Um, but I think it's, interest is a fairly intuitive thing. Ideas, it's the same thing. Ideas and ideologies really kind of shape our political language, our vision of what the world is and what it can be and who we are. And yeah, I think these things, it was ideas that really motivated these Trumpian people. I think, analysis of the people that attacked the Capitol building found that, they were diverse across class. It wasn't just white working class stereotypical rural people that, might be associated with Trump voters or radical right wing supporters in people's minds. People were business owners, some people were very wealthy, and it was really these ideas that seduced them and led them there. So I think ideas are a big motivating factor in politics. Like looking at the last 150 years of history, the rise of Marxism, and then the response of counter-revolutionary and conservative forces against that can if you want to look purely through the lens of ideas, you can say it explains a lot of the history of Europe and the United States and other places around the world. But I think ideas are another layer to the way that politics works. And then you have institutions which are much more concrete. So organizations, laws, norms, policies, ways of doing things are all institutions. So the NHS is an institution. The Supreme Court is an institution. But you could also say that in the U.S., like an issue that's become more talked about is discriminatory housing policies against Black Americans and other minorities. Like you can argue that that's institutional, even if there's no organization of discrimination that exists to do it, but it's sets of practices and beliefs and the norms, thinking that people aren't going to that lead to disparate outcomes. So I think institutions can be more or less abstract or large or small, but they are kind of the means by which political decisions are made, laws are enforced, and and the rules of politics and society are enacted. So I think just to give some different lenses, I think different people. I'm kind of into ideas. That's what I really find stimulating. Different scholars and friends of mine that work on these issues, like people have their own approach and their kind of theoretical frameworks associated with these. But I wanted to you do that as a bit of an intro to this, saying so what's missing from this element. And I think political development and change is much more dynamic than static, and thinking of politics from the perspective of kind of unmoving and unchanging institutions that are sort of moving slowly like tectonic plates beneath, I don't know, the day-to-day of elections and news and things like that is misses the role of individuals in politics. So I think beyond great leaders and important historical figures, the Napoleons and Trumps, not to say great as in good, but important, historically important. It was largely, beyond these kind of main figures, it was largely through the effort of kind of lesser known radicals that political change took place, that people's opinions change on issues over time, that, controversial issues were dealt with. So, and I think people are not, I think an important thing to think of is like people aren't the unconscious product of their structures. People respond to them in different ways. They interpret the world around them. They interact with other people, other ideas, and then some of them change the world around them. And those are the people that we're kind of that I'm interested in, that we're just going to discuss. So I think this brings up a very important theoretical question for social scientists, for historians, for people who are interested in social and political change of structure versus agency. So I think agency is like my what I can do as an individual. I'm in this room recording this lecture right now. I chose to do this, but the structure, the where I was born as a white man in America, and I have certain structural constraints around me that affect different people in different ways. But in terms of explaining change and explaining why things happen in the social and political world, we can attribute some cause, some causal force, like this happened because of the rise of these companies and the rise of capitalism. Or you could say that French history was shaped by the agency of Napoleon as an individual, the choices he made and the decisions that he took. But you have this dichotomy where one is very deterministic and the other is very much about people's opportunity to respond and to act in the way that they choose as individuals. So a structure-oriented approach kind of emphasizes continuity, the dynamics by which organizations and institutions change and impact one another, the importance of structural forces like class, economic change more broadly in shaping human behavior, and analyses are focused kind of on particular organizations and practices or certain changes over time. actor-oriented approach kind of emphasizes change and contingency, the opportunity for political social actors to change the world around them by organizing politically, creating and spreading ideas, working within existing institutions, and the analysis could focus on kind of individuals in certain cases. So how do you kind of resolve this problem of structure versus agency when you're explaining things? So as a good example to illustrate with my own research is sort of about so I'm writing about right-wing populism, but specifically about anti-globalism. So this sort of, the word globalism is thrown around by people like Trump and kind of other right-wing populists today, but it has its origins kind of on the American far right in the 70s and 80s, when I would say that the sort of the vulgar racism and anti-Semitism of the kind of the far right of the interwar period of the middle of the 20th century that was very sympathetic to fascism or led to fascism, that was no longer acceptable in mainstream political discourse. So a lot of these kind of right-wing ideologues and writers, they using they started their own organizations and their own publications, and they turned away from kind of explicit anti-Semitism to a more ambiguous kind of conspiracy theory worldview. So the organizations I look at, it's like several dozen individuals, maybe five of whom are really the main players, but several dozen individuals who wrote books or newsletters about the Freemasons and the Illuminati and the different elements of the conspiracist worldview. Some of which were anti-Semitic, some of which were not. Long story short, a lot of my thesis is kind of reconstructing the world that these guys inhabited. How they, what are the organizations they built? What was the impact of their writings over time, like in terms of shaping the ideological landscape of American right-wing politics. And it's something where they were responding. These individual writers, they were all bad guys, like very anti-Semitic and conspiracist figures. They were responding to changes around them, changes in how media was used in politics. Like they were using radio and some of them were using television, and they were using direct mail kind of to spread their message and to propagate their message. So it's a mix of like the world that like their messages changed as the times changed, but they also it was their own creativity and ingenuity in a way. And I think that's something that a good dissertation or a good paper is able to kind of the interplay between the two, kind of the individuals in history and the structures that they're kind of shaped by. And I think one notion that's useful to describe that sort of reciprocal relationship is reflexivity, because it is a reflexive relationship between structural social forces and individual acts of free will. I hope that this makes sense, because it's to me quite a kind of theoretically interesting idea that underpins a lot of these kind of questions. So to move on finally to the topic, American radicalism. So what is radicalism? Is it left or right wing phenomenon? Does it go beyond or predate the left right divide that we kind of use to understand politics today? The kind of notion of a left right divide is as old almost as the French Revolution, so almost 200 years old. But as a way of understanding the political landscape, I think it's a more recent phenomenon, really, of the sort of post-war period, kind of from the 1950s on. So I have two quotes about radicalism, which kind of capture some interesting elements of it. First is President Theodore Roosevelt. The greatest virtue of my radicalism lies in the fact that I am perfectly ready, if necessary, to be radical on the conservative side. So I think just to show radicalism doesn't have to mean left-wing politics. It could be radical. You have people who identify as radical conservatives. And then this other quote is by an American writer and Civil War veteran, famous sort of man of letters in the U.S., Ambrose Bierce. And he's has very witty kind of lines. This is a good one. Radicalism, the conservatism of tomorrow, injected into the affairs of today. And that illustrates a good point of what views that might be radical right now would have been pretty conservative in the past, or views that were conservative in the past may be radical now. A lot of examples to think of. If we could do a discussion, I would want to go through some, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So I have this nice picture of Mr. Washington, and we will start off with one of my favorite figures in American history, Thomas Paine. So I'll show this video just to introduce Mr. Paine to you all, if you haven't heard of him. So that was a nice introduction to Thomas Paine, the kind of world that he lived in of the American Revolution. So he was described as a corset maker by trade, a journalist by profession, and a propagandist by inclination, which is a nice line. Paine was a British. He was English, and he had a fairly, by the time he was in his late 30s, hadn't had much success in his life and his career, but he went on to be probably the most important thinker of the American Revolution and of the broader kind of revolutionary period of the late 18th century as well, because his ideas were also quite influential in the French Revolution, and he actually was elected to government in France after the French Revolution. But his pamphlet Common Sense for the American case is the most important. So the equivalent would have been of the 150,000 copies that were circulated would have been 15 million copies today. Um, and you have this quote from President John Adams at the bottom that the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington, would have been raised in vain. And I think to really illustrate the beauty of his language and the beauty of his rhetoric and his ability to mobilize people, I wanted this is another short video. So there's a number of great lines from that. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. The idea that tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, but still must be conquered in order to achieve this celestial goal of freedom. It's a yeah, beautiful, beautiful language, and I think his influence was obvious in mobilizing the American colonists into fighting against the British. Sorry about that. So after the Revolution, Paine moved to France. He had famous kind of not debates, but sort of like battles with Edmund Burke, who's the kind of the father of British conservatism. Paine was an avowed revolutionary, and Burke advocated for conservative reformism. Um, Shortly after moving to France, he was elected to the post-revolutionary elected body, and he was involved in the sort of, not in the violence of the French Revolution era, but the sort of political intrigue, um, which was really shaped by his own ideas about the rights of mankind, of individual man, and being against monarchy and for the motion of republican government. But ultimately, he died. It says 1906. He died in 1806, poor and unpopular because he became a very prominent proponent of deism and the sort of anti-Christian kind of idea, which despite his otherwise popular political ideas, that really turned people against him. And I think historically, his kind of importance has returned, but at the time of his death, his radical anti-Christian views apparently outweighed the value of his radical views that led to the foundation of the United States. Um, so one interesting question with Paine is the power of the printing press, because that without the printing press he wouldn't have been able to mass produce this pamphlet. Um, could you compare that to the internet of the day? Like the people that you think of now as political radicals or political thinkers online, they're using YouTube videos or maybe newsletters or different many different media can be used. But I think an important thing we're thinking about, particularly about people who are produce ideas, who are writers, is that whether it's books or newsletters or pamphlets or things like that, that not just the role of the ideas and the arguments themselves and the words themselves and their abstract power, but also the important role of media in in spreading those ideas. And this is something we can discuss a bit more in the Q&A, but that's something that I always keep in mind, because for my research, the kind of stuff I'm studying, these right-wing conspiracist types in the 60s and 70s and 80s, their ideas weren't that good. Like it's not like if you think of the sort of marketplace of ideas in which the best ideas win, these are sort of flimsy conspiracy theories based on either lies or misrepresentations of the facts, or very speculative arguments, and more often than not, some anti-Semitic propaganda or sort of stereotype or things like that. So it wasn't because their ideas were good that they spread. It was because they were really good at using media, radio, using mailing lists to kind of find people who were receptive to those audience, and that requires very technical skill. Look at the picture, the guy in the picture, the printing press, like doing that is different than the ability to sit at the page and write down something that's going to raise the hair on the back of the listener's neck, or really get their attention, or really get an emotional response. But the ability to combine those two skills is what makes some of these figures so important. But to me, yeah, just an interesting question that I like to reflect on. So the next figure is John Brown, who's probably a bit less known. So he was an American abolitionist and who was deeply opposed to slavery and believed it should be ended by any means necessary. So he spent much of his life working on the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves from the South get to the free North and kind of secure their freedom there. Um, two quotes from him: "These men are all talk. What is needed is action. Action. And I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no peace in this land until slavery is done for." So John Brown conducted a famous raid on Harper's Ferry, which this video will describe in much better detail than I can. So that kind of gives some context for the Harper's Ferry raid, which led to Brown's death by hanging. Um, but he was living at a time when you had a growing abolitionist movement in the north of the U.S. It had no influence in the South, where the slaveholding sort of aristocracy dominated Southern society. Um, but in the North, which had freed slaves at a certain point, there was a growing movement. They had their own publications. They tried to curry political influence, and it was indirectly, it was through pressure by abolitionists that didn't lead to the Civil War, because ultimately the secession of the South after the election of Lincoln is what triggered the cause of the Civil War. But the rise of the abolitionist movement added, led to the acceleration, not the acceleration, but the tensions between pro-slave and anti-slavery forces kind of increasing. And that was kind of where Brown was socialized and radicalized. So how was he seen by his contemporaries and by history? So, an anonymous letter: while I cannot approve of all of your acts, I stand in awe of your position since your capture, and dare not oppose you, lest I be found fighting against God. For you speak as one having authority, and seem to be strengthened from on high. And this one is from Frederick Douglass, who was an African American leader for abolition at the time. His zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light, his was as the burning sun. Mine was bounded by time, his stretched away to the silent shores of eternity. I could speak for the slave. John Brown could fight for the slave. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave. Sorry for the melodramatic telling, but it's a powerful message from someone that's seen as Frederick Douglass is seen as one of the main figures for abolition in the mid 19th century, and one of the most prominent Black Americans at the time. Um, Historian James Loewen surveyed American history textbooks and noted that historians considered Brown perfectly sane until about 1890, but generally portrayed him as insane from about 1890 until 1970, when newer interpretations began to gain ground. Um, so with Brown, he's someone, I think he's a great example of someone who was extremely polarizing to people in the South. He was a terrorist, and he killed men and women. He killed, like, a lot of people died during the Harper's Ferry raid. It was an attempted insurrection against the kind of standing order of slavery at the time, and it was something that for many people was a betrayal of America in a way. Other people, it was fighting for what America really stands for equality, even if it requires radical action. And I think he's someone who it's hard to, like, it's impossible to say that political violence is good in any instance. But this is one where you can sympathize with the cause, and when you read what he wrote and read about his actions, it's I don't know. His moral fervor and righteousness is somewhat sympathetic. The next character is William Jennings Bryan. So he was three-time Democratic presidential candidate, 1896, 1900, and 1908. He never won. He was never the president. He was probably the most famous speaker and orator of the time. He was known to address tens of thousands of listeners, and he traveled the world giving speeches. Had friendships with world leaders and prominent figures around the world who recognized his genius. Um, so he was a main figure in what is called the populist movement. So the populist movement in the late 19th century United States is a very complex, kind of multifaceted movement. It was largely oriented by individual people in the western states, kind of small farm holders, small business people that lived in kind of small towns. The sort of the notion of the butcher, the baker, the shoemaker, the kind of independent person. They own their own land, they own their own business. They're kind of self-sufficient, but they exist within this sort of interdependent frontier community. Um, and there was a period of incredible change in the U.S. when you had a lot of migration to the West, um, of people kind of building new towns, building new industries and things like that in different Western states that had previously been unoccupied by American white American colonists. Obviously, you had Native American people who were pushed west and pushed onto reservations as a part of this story. Um, but for the for the development of the United States proper, it was a period where you had a lot of people moving to the west, but you also had the growth of industry and of kind of industrial capitalism, and really importantly the railroads, because the spread of the railroads around the U.S. is what enabled these states to have farmers in the west able to send their goods to the east and vice versa. But the railroads had a lot of power. They had a sort of monopolistic role in making laws and the rates that they charged, and you had issues with credit that it was given to farmers where they borrowed money for new equipment and then they couldn't pay it because the price of their crop went down and they were stuck in debt. And it was a lot of farmers were in debt and lost their farms in the 1870s, 80s, 90s in this period. And a big issue, which is now kind of irrelevant to contemporary politics, was of bimetallism. So this notion that at the time gold was the primary backing, was the backing for the currency, but people traded in silver, and silver had some value. And a big argument for the populists was that you should have bimetallism, so silver should back the currency as well, because that would inflate the currency supply, which would be bad for the very wealthy asset holders, for the trusts that control the railroads, but for the small farmer, for the independent kind of freeholder, it would be very good for them. So a famous speech by William Jennings Bryan, maybe his most famous speech, was the Cross of Gold, which is sort of captured in this cartoon, showing him as this sort of messiah-like figure holding the cross, and this line, also kind of invoking the biblical, like Christ-like imagery: "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this cross of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." So the idea that the maintaining the gold standard in preventing silver from becoming a currency was was the crown of thorns on the laboring, the working people, and crucifying mankind upon a cross of gold is the same imagery, obviously. And it's something that's a bit weird because this is such a kind of like a dated debate, but this was an extremely controversial issue at the time. Um, Brian was a very polarizing figure. So you have this one previously where he looks like Jesus, and then this one where William Jennings, that's him, his head on the sort of the populist party snake, devouring the Democratic Party in a way. It's odd, kind of like, because he ran in 1896, but he was seen as an outsider by many Democrats, and he was very popular, but he ultimately was unable to win any elections. Um, and then another one kind of showing him as a snake oil salesman. This is the best ever. You can see the sort of these tonic bottles, Dr. Bryan's special railroad tonic. You can see the other one, anti-militarism antidote. Um, it kind of goes on. And then another one showing that he's a puppet of silver interests. Him being a like literally a puppet for the kind of wealthy, stereotype of the wealthy guy, and then fooling the sort of the populist supporter, kind of on the left, seen as sort of maybe a naive rural kind of farmer. Um, but it kind of these different cartoons show the different way. These are all, and you can think of it all as different metaphors for representing what he represented in the political world, because he was a very important political figure on the American landscape. Both his supporters and his critics wrote about him a lot in the media at the time. But he could be represented as a puppet or a snake or as a messiah. Like all of these are really metaphors for what does this man mean to political life. And I think that kind of shows that really the different ways that these people can be portrayed and can be constructed into a narrative. So they can be painted as crazy and sincere, kind of productive. Um, One thing I think relevant to this, like, is the character of Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, a very polarizing figure in a way like Brian. I don't think he has or had the charisma that Brian had, or the speaking ability. I think I didn't mind Corbyn, but I think that he was not a very charismatic or compelling leader. But he's someone who his portrayal in the media played a big part in how he was understood. And I think Brian is someone who I think he was pretty widely hated at the time by those who he was like hated or loved. But I think he's someone who his intentions were good, and I think the way that he was portrayed, often by somewhat conservative interests, kind of colored him in a more negative light than he actually should have been seen. Obviously, Corbyn is his own person and has his own history, but I just thought that was a somewhat interesting comparison given the British politics kind of connection. So I'm gonna pause here and just switch to another video, if that's okay with you all.